Stories don't define you. How you tell them will.
Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and chief story maker at Elkins Consulting. In my work with coaching clients, I guide people to improve their communication using storytelling as the foundation of our work together. What I've realized over years of coaching and podcasting is that the majority of people don't realize the impact of the stories they share on their internal messages and on the people they're sharing them with. What really lights me up is guiding executives in uncovering the stories in their lives that are meaningful. The stories that, when shared with the right audience in the right way, connect, inspire, and motivate. Here's what a former client had to say about our work together. As a leader of leaders, I struggle with how and when to use my stories to emphasize the points my audience is looking for. It's a delicate balance between sounding like I'm bragging and delivering a message that needs to be heard. Sarah's approach to storytelling clears that obstacle so that you can deliver a clear and concise message using your stories to emphasize your points. It's truly amazing when it all comes together. Greg McDonough, Blackburn Capital Advisors, and president of the Entrepreneurs Organization of Washington, D.C. Visit elkinsconsulting.com to learn more about working with me. Today, I'm so eager to get started in this conversation with my new guest, Kat Barker. I was introduced to Kat via the fabulously talented Shelley Brown, whose book is going to come out here in May. It was to be called The Glue is Drying, but now it's going to be called Weird Girl Adventures. And I'm super excited to get my hands on that book. But in the meantime, Shelley has made quite a few great introductions for me. So when she says, "Do you want an introduction to my friend Kat?" I said, yes. So all I know about Kat is that she used to work for Second City. So she is all about improv. And in our conversation before I hit record, we discussed the adaptability talent. And that absolutely helped in her success in that role. But she's made a major transition, and that's what we're going to talk about as we get more into the podcast. So, Kat, I would love to hear something about you that most people probably don't know. And I ask that question because I love for our audience to develop some context around who it is that they're going to be hearing the stories about and from.
Amazing. Thank you for having me, by the way. I'm very excited to do this. And I love Shelley Brown too. But I was trying to think of what's something that not everyone knows, because I'm a little bit of an open book. And I was thinking about, one of the things that I've trained in is cranial sacral therapy. And so I did 400 hours of doing it. And most people know that I'm a cranial sacral therapist along with other modalities that I use, but they don't actually know how much I loved the training that I went through. And it's actually the reason that I love the training too is because it appealed to the deeply spiritual side of me and the part of me that loves healing, but also it appealed to the comedian part of me. When I went through it, I'd actually been doing improv for a decade and was teaching for Second City and went into my own personal healing work and ended up in the middle of that work being introduced to cranial sacral, which I had no idea what it was. It's basically someone is laying on a massage table and you're using really light touch and intention to bring the body back into balance, with the idea that trauma gets held in the body or unexpressed emotion gets caught in the body too. So you're helping to stabilize the central nervous system so that whatever needs to be released can be released. So I ended up loving this because as someone who's deeply, deeply sensitive and emotional, it was like my chance to get on a massage table and cry for an hour and have someone attend to me. And was so fascinated by it that the therapist I was seeing at the time was like, there's a training in this. So I decided to take this training, which is like a 180 for me because I'm doing improv. I'm fully immersed in just comedy at this point. And now I'm driving out it's a 400-hour long training. So I'm driving out to the suburbs of Chicago every month or so. and going and training in this like very sad, darkened Marriott Convention Center. And it's like Disneyland to me. I'm like, this is my favorite thing in the world to do. And I would go in and we would deeply, deeply process, you know. So I would go in and like cry and move, you know, emotion gets stuck in the body. So you actually have to move the body with it as you're doing it. And I'm like, the ridiculousness of there's all of these people crying and moving on massage tables. And it's in this convention center where there's like little Miss pageants and like dentistry conventions and stuff. And you're just hearing like howling and crying from this room. It was my very favorite thing. And the man who was teaching it to me is actually a shaman. And so his idea, he had kind of extended what traditional cranial sacral was, which kind of addresses both the physical and the emotional, but he had extended it into the spiritual as well. So he was telling us that, you know, you might not only have repressed emotion from this lifetime, but it could be other lifetimes too, which is a huge consciousness jump for people who haven't even pondered that yet. And right. I would go from like processing like mother stuff from when I was younger to all of a sudden I'm in other lifetimes and like equally emoting. And my comedic brain, which is the truth teller inside of me, was like, I'm either going crazier or this is like the most profound experience I've ever had. And I can't quite tell the difference.
There's an irony there, isn't it?
Yeah. And I wasn't actually there for this. This is my very favorite story that they told, just because I loved like the clash of context of these things, was that there's in level 4, you do what's called a mandible ritual, which sounds creepy, but it's not, where someone actually lays down, you have a couple practitioners working on them and they're working on the jaw, and the jaw is where we repress a lot of our rage or anger that we're not able to express. Anything that's unexpressed gets caught in the jaw. And so you would have a couple people working on you for a couple hours. And this one woman had gotten so deeply into the process of releasing some of her rage that she's growling, which again, out of context, it's just the strangest thing ever. When you're in the space, it makes perfect sense. But she had gotten to the point where she was growling and crawling around the room, and she ended up crawling out the door. So now they're having to explain you know, the dentist convention, like what's happening. And they were like, no one's going to understand what this is. Like out of context, there's just no way. And so they ended up telling everyone that she was in a method acting class and like slowly bringing her back into the room.
Oh my gosh.
My favorite story about it. But yeah, we would emote and then like hit an Applebee's for lunch. And I was like, this is the best thing I've ever done.
Wow. That's so cool, Kat. I mean, I get this because anytime you do anything that's deep like that, there still has to be the other side of it, right? Yeah. Like you're not doing it in a vacuum. Even my friend Sabrina Woods did a retreat, but like the no talking retreat for a while. And I don't know if it was 3 days or 5 days or whatever, but eventually you have to go back to real life. And there's always that weird transition from that deep experience to, oh, there are cars driving around and somebody just honked at me. And, and transitioning like that can be such a shock, or it can be hilarious. It's like one or the other. I don't know if it could be both.
I feel like after I would do 4-day stretches of this, and then you just go into a period of collapse afterwards where
you're exhausted.
And you're exhausted. I feel like every time I've gone on a spiritual retreat, there is that space afterwards too, where you have such a profound opening in the space and in a collective space with other people. And then you get home and you're by yourself in the real world and you're like, my life doesn't make sense and I'm lost once again. All of the epiphany that I had is now down the toilet.
Exactly. You just reminded me of the conference, the No Longer Virtual conference that I've been hosting for 4 years. And this year will be the 5th year if people can come in late June or early June. And I remember the first time we did it, it was in Atlanta, and it was this amazing experience at the Ritz-Carlton in downtown Atlanta. And there were 23 of us in the room all day the first day. And we got so tight. We were talking about such incredible things about business and growing our businesses and connecting on this really deep level. And then we all went out to dinner at this Chinese restaurant. And I remember going back to the hotel with my husband, who was there to support and be my gopher. And I remember waking up the next morning feeling that, like, this weirdness about what is it going to be like when I walk into the room now, after we spent all day together yesterday, and then we were apart for 8 hours to sleep. Now we're going back into this room. And I remember having that sense of trepidation. What's it going to be like? Because we were all so open yesterday. Are people going to be nervous about seeing each other today after all that? And so it ended up being amazing. And a lot of people came the next year from that first year.
Yeah.
But the big one was this past year. We were in Chicago on March 12th and 13th. So it was right before everything shut down in 2020. And there were 20 of us. I had 40 registered. There were 20 of us in the room. And it was like we created this little bubble of comfort and hugs before we all went back to our homes and our jobs that were completely uncertain and like just a complete disaster compared to where we were before we left for Chicago. And then we have these 2 days of tight, really, I would call it spiritual. It was so tribal.
Yes.
This community that was created in this bubble on the top of the Aon building in Chicago. And so I'm remembering vividly, because of the way you described that transition when we're all trying to get home and flights are canceled and moving things and trying to get people back to where they want to go, but safely. And it was like, once we're all in there, we're talking, we all feel great about what we're going to do next. And then we go home and none of the people around us had experienced that. I call that the after conference hangover.
Yeah.
When, like, a couple days later, it's like you were never there.
Yeah. Like a vulnerability hangover.
Yes. Oh my gosh. But luckily with NLV, the network stays super tight. And so we're all still interacting a year later. So
that's great.
Yeah.
I feel like it speaks to the power of collective consciousness too. Mm-hmm. It is so hard. It's like when we're changing or in the process of transition and our outer world or the people that we've identified with for such a long time still remain in the same space and we're trying to go through a change. It can be a painful awakening process inside of that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I talk about that a lot, about the need for authenticity to be able to shift.
Yeah.
Because you're authentic in your skin at every different point. It's a different version of you. So it's hard to understand what authenticity really means when it's constantly evolving.
Exactly.
That's interesting. So tell me, you, during our conversation before I hit record, you mentioned something about working for Second City and being an improv. Tell me a little bit about that. And then tell me what made you decide not to do that anymore. What was a trigger, an event that made you decide not to do it anymore?
Well, it's interesting because I don't know if I had a clear, I think people go through this all the time. I don't think it was like one world into a different world. I think that there was a lot of overlap. So it's been an interesting process of integration for me. I started off, I got a theater degree in college and actually here in LA, and ended up freaking out about what it actually meant to be an actor in LA and what it meant to audition, and felt like I needed more training and was very drawn to comedy always. So I moved to Chicago to be kind of immersed in the improv world. Because at that point, if you wanted to do improv, you moved to Chicago. And so there wasn't a ton of thought process in terms of how I was going to build a career, but just this is what I loved. So I trained at all the big theaters there and then ended up, along with performing and writing, I started teaching for Second City very young too. I was about a year and a half into improv and ended up going through their directing programs that they had there, which at the time put you into teaching. So there was a very fast transition from just enjoying it as my passion to actually teaching as well. And I love teaching. I don't think I ever thought consciously that I wanted to be a teacher, but teaching came very naturally. And so I taught there for over a decade in their training center. And then at the same time was also, pursuing my own creative career that was growing. And then ended up, I feel like this happens all the time, ended up hitting a wall with everything so I had always been drawn to mystical, spiritual things. I grew up with a mom who's a therapist. My whole family are therapists, which is why I had to go into comedy, truly. But I end up wanting to distance myself from kind of a life of like a lot of analysis and a lot of internal searching. But what's interesting is as I was kind of holding it at arm's distance, I was still really drawn to it. And I was really drawn to spirituality too. So those were my two other passions in some ways. And I ended up finding a therapist who was very holistic in her approach, who I started doing therapy with. And she was the one who enlightened me to the idea of, when we get stuck in our own trauma, it's really because trauma is inside of the body. And so that's how I got into the cranial sacral work, which I was kind of secretly doing on the side with no intention of wanting to do any sort of healing work for anyone else, but just that I wanted that level. I wanted 400 hours of work on myself because I thought I would be a really different person by the end too. And a lot of things that I was bumping up against in my own improv career around perfectionism and anxiety and, trying to navigate through, I'd say I had a very fragile ego around doing improv too. I had really progressed really fast. And then part of my falling apart was what happens when I don't get something, when I don't get an audition, because I'm not stabilized enough in myself. So it's not just me not getting the audition. This is a sign to me that I'm not supposed to be doing what I love doing too. And so that's why I had pursued the healing work.
Can I interrupt for just a second?
Yeah.
I'm just really curious. It seemed to me as you're telling this story, now our listeners can only hear us, but I'm watching your expressions as you're speaking. Yeah. And it seems to me that a specific thing, a specific experience kind of came into your vision that you were thinking about. I don't know if it was related to not getting something that you auditioned for, or just you were almost like anticipating not getting something as opposed to it actually happening. Is that what was going on? You were grieving before anything happened?
I think it was a combination of both. I think it was, whenever I auditioned, there was a certain level of pressure and fear. I mean, they say you can't really be an actor unless you can get used to failure on some level. And improv is its own beast because it's not just like you're reading a script, you're bringing yourself to stage too. So I was noticing such a difference between the natural play when I was either in rehearsal or really performing in front of people, but there was a natural give and take with the audience and there was a lot of fluidity around it. And then as soon as I went into an audition space and there was the idea of someone else judging me, all of my natural gifts would go out the window. And I'd be working from a space of panic. And improv is so interesting because you have to calm the body enough. You have to be in a state of play to actually excel at it too. And you actually have to be unafraid on some level in order to do it. And I just couldn't get into that space in an audition space. And it felt like I was getting stuck there.
Do you remember a specific audition now that you look back?
Yeah. So Second City has touring companies. And I remember, I think there was a lot of things that would actually come up for me when I was auditioning. the Second City Touring Company it's like the one place that you have the potential to make money in improv in Chicago. So there's a lot of status attached to it. And I would find myself not being able to sleep the entire night before. So I'm going in totally unslept. And then I have my own level of perfectionism that's playing out. And then I'm also an empath too. So I'm empathing everyone else's anxiety.
Absorbing it.
And, you get onto stage with someone else who's panicking on stage too. And it's very hard to kind of work yourself through the process. And I just remember, a lot of times people, in order to get on Second City's touring company, audition 10 times. It's like I'm auditioning every year as it comes around. And for me, it was an invite only audition, which was exciting to get in the first place. And I didn't do well at that. And I went, well, I guess it's over. There wasn't an endurance or a resilience inside of me around it because there was so much inner questioning about it. And I also... Was that your first audition for that touring?
I
think I auditioned twice for them. So I had one regular audition when I had first started improv, which it didn't have as many stakes to me because I didn't feel like I knew how to improvise as well. And then I had that, and that was it.
And you didn't really know what to expect. And so it was like, I'll just do whatever. There wasn't so much pressure. Right. Yeah. But then the second one, tell me about the second audition.
The second one's honestly a blur to me. I'll say there's another factor that's playing out at the same time, which actually is a theme in my life, which is that I end up doing something professionally before I'm quite ready to do it. And so because I had started teaching so young along the way, one of the things that had come up was that I was teaching people who were in my class, who I was then going to go be in another class with at a different theater. And so imposter syndrome that comes up in that, and the level of, I have perfectionism, which I don't even like to say is perfectionism because I think I have such perfectionism that it's hard for me to even think that I have perfectionism because I can't hit perfect. It's like a weird wormhole that I can go into about it. But I felt like I had to be perfect in order for them to not discover that somehow I was still in the process of learning. So I have a lot of expectation on myself inside of that time. And I just remember in that specific audition, we call it on the back line, like you get off the back line to go enter into a scene. I felt paralyzed in that moment of, I don't know how to get myself off the back line. And I feel unworthy of being here in this space of where people have been invited into too. And there's so much comparison going on for me at the same time. So this thing that there's a real simplicity around me loving it now has me completely in my head and stuck. And so there was a lot of shame, I think, coming out of it too. Mm-hmm. And I didn't have the toolkit inside of myself to be able to weather that shame really well. Because I watched other people that I performed with get knocked down and get back up really easily. But there was always an internal questioning for me of, am I doing the right thing?
So is this on a theater stage that you have to audition, or is it like it's on a stage? So you have also the intimidation factor of being on stage with lights. And the reason I'm asking this is because I love a story that puts me there with you. And I felt like I was back on that back line with you.
Yeah.
As you're like, I don't even know how to step off of here. Like, how do I even, and even though you've been teaching people how to do this, mm-hmm. you had that paralyzed feeling. So as you're imagining, can you visualize that stage? Are you there again on that particular stage? Do you remember who was with you at that moment?
I don't remember exactly. I remember who was in the audience because that's where my focus was, I think, in some ways. And so you have all the producers from Second City that are there. and some other people who are directors for the touring company and stuff. And there's a lot of focus outwards instead of actually who's with me.
Okay.
So you can imagine like staring into an audience that you're perceiving, judging your talent.
Right. I can imagine that intimidation. And I'm sure the audition itself is a blur. Do you remember coming back to yourself sometime after that audition and like, because you mentioned you thought, okay, that's it. I can't do improv because I failed this audition. Do you remember when that happened? Do you have any?
I think it's not that I ever cut off doing improv. It's that I found myself wanting to retreat and to hide.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, moving into a certain level of protection around it, and there were I feel like there was a sense of, it wasn't just that singular audition. There was really a sense of life as it's going right now can't keep going this way. And that's extending into my personal life as well. It's like everything's kind of falling in or imploding on itself. And I remember the moment of recognizing, because I had had these really beautiful intuitive readings throughout my life. I joke about, I'm like, of course I was going to end up doing some of this work because people have found me. I think a woman found me when I was working in a flower shop before. It was a 6-month transition between college and then moving to Chicago. And she just walked in and said, I want to give you an intuitive reading. Will you teach me how to arrange flowers as an exchange? And she had told me a lot about myself. I kept having these really beautiful intuitive readings where there was awakenings attached to them, and they had kind of acted as a compass to guide me in the right direction. But it wasn't consistent enough help. And I remember at a certain point I think it was after I'd gotten headshots done too, and I had been obsessed with the perfectionism about the headshot. I was watching the perfectionism play out with that. You get 500 pictures of yourself. And now, I'm looking at my eyes and the width of my nose. And there's some of those perfectionistic, dysmorphic qualities were coming out. And I had been in tears all day. And I remember saying, I need help. Like, I actually really need someone to walk me through this, because I can't do it on my own. And I think that was the moment where I decided to find a therapist who could help me through that process after wanting to run as far away from therapy as I could because of my upbringing. I actually recognized that I needed someone to do that. And I also wanted someone who was open to all of the other spiritual things, because that was really important to me. To be able to integrate those parts too. But that changed my life. It was a real true recognition of I need help with this.
Mm-hmm. Was it the first session, or was it not until you were able to process the first session? And what I mean is, I know that one of my good friends had struggled all her life and had dismissed the idea of therapy and counseling because her family just didn't do that. And this is a Montana thing, by the way. Midwestern, I think, is even worse than anywhere else. But so she went to this counselor, and she remembers the first time that she was speaking to this counselor and how anticlimactic it was for her. She had an hour session with this person, and she talked about some of what was going on. And this happened to be a very intuitive and intelligent counselor. And he said one thing to her right before she left that she didn't really hear, but he must have known what he was doing, because it just kind of wiggled its way into her head afterward. She heard it, but she didn't really hear it. It wasn't until a week later where I don't know if she was riding her bike or what. And for some reason that what he said popped into her head, and she had to stop her bike and lost it, just started sobbing her eyes out. It was a week later that she processed what had happened in that room. And at the time, she was like, I'm not going back. It was stupid. I'm not going back. And I was like, give it another chance, because it sounds like he was really intuitive. And she's like, no, it's stupid. It was a total waste of time and money. I'm like, give it another chance. And it was the day she was supposed to go back to him, because it had been a week, and she was going to see him weekly for the first 4 weeks, just to try to do the getting to know you phase. And she called me from the side of the road, bawling her eyes out. I'm like, are you okay? You want me to? So that's why I'm asking that question, because I think in a lot of cases, we're so resistant to it that during the session, we don't really understand what we're getting, and it takes a little while. So do you remember that?
What's funny is, because I grew up with a mom who is a therapist, there's some part of me that is very trained in being able to open myself up emotionally very fast, almost probably too much so.
Too fast, right? I hear you.
Any sort of therapy or spiritual training, I'll probably cry before we even get into anything. When I was going through the cranial sacral classes, I would lay down on the massage table and no one would have even touched me, and I would just start crying because my body was ready to release. It's time. I remember the feeling. I don't know if there was anything specifically that she said, but I remember the feeling of containment with it, of I can come in here and I'm not responsible for anyone else, and how because I'm hyper vigilant on some level, which makes me a really good improviser too. I'm just highly aware of everyone else all the time, and my environment. So there was something about being able to come in and kind of move inside of myself and not have to worry about how that was affecting someone else. Mm-hmm. I remember the space that she held with me around that. I felt safe and understood. And to me, I had done therapy throughout my life because my mom had tried to seek out other therapists for me when I was younger. And one of the things that I had always had an arm's distance to, I think in some ways, is I don't want someone to just sit here and analyze me and say, a lot of the time too. And
right.
I think at some point, this therapist got up off of the chair that she was sitting in and just came and sat next to me. And there was something that was really disarming about that in the process of having someone say, I understand you, and not feeling like I had to hold all of it. Because I was also in a new relationship at the time that this was all happening too. And I think the irony about being in this was my first really safe relationship that I'd been in. And I think because of that, all of my wounding came up as well. I think that's kind of the weird paradox of the whole thing too, is, this is safe, so let me show you all of my inner child right now.
Yeah.
I think I also knew that I had a responsibility not to just put that on the relationship and put that on him. So to have someone hold a container for it felt really deeply relieving to me. I was surprised at how relieving it was. It
sounds like she, because of sitting next to you, it felt connected. Yeah. Because the way you described other sessions, it feels very disconnected. Mm-hmm. Like they're just listening, they're analyzing, they're not with me. But it seemed like when you described her sitting next to you, that you felt connected with her in a way that allowed that space.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, whether or not it was parenting in a certain era or my specific experience growing up, I don't feel like there was enough physical containment. I think that there's, for me, actually, if my love language is anything, it's being held too. So there's something about the closeness of that. And I think this is why the cranial sacral work really appealed to me. And now I do a different type of therapy for myself called somatic therapy, which is essentially you don't need a practitioner to work on you. You're starting to identify what you're feeling in your own body. So you're slowing down the story and you're actually feeling into what's happening, which I think is just deeply profound work. But I do think that you're right. It's something about the proximity and the physical containment of it that made a big difference to me.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So when did you decide, this is what I want to do? This helped me so much. This is what I want to do.
So I ended up going through the entire program in Chicago and practicing on, people that I know or friends to begin with. And then this is about 5 years ago, I decided to move out to LA for creative purposes. Because part of what happened too is I started healing creatively as I was doing this work. And so what's interesting, I move out here to do this work and there is a shop in Los Feliz in LA called Liberate. And I ended up going into there because I was very drawn to this place and then drawn to this specific practitioner who was an intuitive and also did theta healing. And I decide that I want to go see her. So I book a session with her, kind of sight unseen. And halfway through, she's giving me this intuitive reading. She goes, "Oh, you're a healer." And I was like, "Well, not really. That's not really what I want to do. I want to do all of this stuff creatively." And she went, "No, you're gifted at what you do." She's like, "We'll see if you can work here 2 days a week." So I was given a job at this place. So in some ways, I feel like the universe chose me to do some of this work. And I still had, so I should back up. I start working there and doing energy work. And then I'm really, really drawn to take a class that's being offered there that we get at a discount for the Akashic records. And I don't even fully know what the Akashic records are, but I live my life intuitively. Some part of me knew that I was supposed to go take this class. So I go take this class, and the Akashic records, for people who don't know, is the idea that every soul has its own vibrational record of everything that's ever happened. So it could be this lifetime, it could be other lifetimes, and that you can actually, as a practitioner, do a prayer and tap into a channel and channel through the vibration of the soul to actually understand on some level why the soul is here, what the soul is choosing to learn in this particular incarnation. And you're shown in some ways the highest path, the highest potential for the soul, and then what's the resistance that gets in the way. And so, ironically enough, I think that the Akashic records could be likened to spiritual therapy in that way. I train in this and I fall in love with it. And just like teaching in the past, I get thrown in right away to being an Akashic records reader, which to me, after 400 hours of training and working on people to be thrown straight into it, I was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. And I still, because I always have on some level my comedic skepticism around things, had such a fear of, I cannot go in and be a fraud around this. Like, I cannot sit with someone if I don't fully trust this in myself. But I would start reading for people and they would start crying. And people would be amazed, like, how do you know this about me? And it felt so, I realized that, here's the interesting thing. I think if we don't train in any of this work, we'll never fully recognize that we have the gifts that we do. Because one of the things that happened for me in cranial sacral therapy was that I didn't realize the level of empath and intuitive I was. I would be able to lay my hands on someone and know in my body where they hurt. I would go over and work on someone's shoulder and they'd ask me, how do you know to work on my shoulder? And I'd say, because it hurts in my body. So, and as I was starting to do that work, I intuitively knew how to move energy in someone's body. There was all the training and all the different specific holds that you have. But I could tell you from the first level, some part of me knew how to do this. And the irony is that I actually think improv is the same thing, because you're working a channel the entire time. I think artists and creatives use this all the time. So, and improv is training of stepping into the unknown. So you have to trust yourself. So I started trusting myself in the energy work that I was doing. And then I trusted myself with the Akashic records, because one of the ways that my gifts come through is through clear cognizance, which is clear knowing. So I never fully understood that I had intuition, because it was just, I knew that I knew a lot about people, but I didn't understand the depth of what I was picking up. And then when I opened up the channel, like I tell people when I teach the Akashic records, it's interesting. It's like if the faucet is dripping for my intuition, opening up someone's Akashic records feels like turning on the channel all the way so that the water is coming fully through. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is that I don't know what I'm going to say a lot of times until I start speaking it, which is exactly improv. The irony of this is hilarious to me, because they're the exact same thing. Yeah, so I started doing that. And at a certain point, I didn't have to work at Liberate anymore. And I started having my own clientele. And the reason I say it's not a full jump over is I was still working for Second City. I was doing corporate facilitation for them too at the same time.
From LA?
Yeah. So they're international. So at the time, prior to the pandemic, they were just flying us all over the place. And we go do either a communications workshop or storytelling. And so I had all of that work supporting me. And then I had this newly blossoming spiritual career. And then I have all of the creative stuff because I'm a writer as well and a storyteller. And one of the things that's been strange is that it feels to me like this is a slow process of integration, of integrating all the gifts together. Because it's not just like, oh, I want to go do mystical stuff now. It feels like they've always been meant to be together and that they're just kind of coming together as a braid. And what's really interesting is I see this all the time when I read people's Akashic records. One of the things that I see is that so many of us come down with all of these different gifts. So we've got all of these different expressions of ourselves. And we're so used to being in a culture where it's supposed to be one primary thing, or we're supposed to understand who we are, as opposed to fully integrating all the parts so that that creates a singular voice or a singular purpose. But it's unique to who we are. And I think this is where we're evolving to. So it's really exciting to me in the work to help people vision that, to actually say, oh, and I think similar to our conversation even before we started, I think it's a combination sometimes of people's gifts and people's wounds. Because I think a lot of the places that I was initially wounded have my adaptation or my development around it has really brought about my gifts as well. So.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
I definitely see that. And it's part of why this podcast exists.
Yeah.
The title, Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Tell Them Will. So it's not the things that happen in your life that define you and give you the gifts. It's how you resolve those things or how you handle those things that happen in your life and how you talk about them. So I love that you're saying all this, partly because early on in my relationship with Shelley Brown, the woman who introduced us, she was saying that she has all these different interests and she didn't know, should her website be this or should her website be that? Or, how do I present this? Because these are two totally different things. I'm like, but they're not two totally different things.
Right.
And so many times we'd have these discussions and I would say, no, it's like there's this umbrella of mindfulness and you're addressing different target audiences under this umbrella of mindfulness. It's all the same you.
Yeah.
And you are bringing your entire self to every piece of it. So you have to integrate it. And she still had that corporate mindset that she can't bring mindfulness to corporations in the same way that she brings mindfulness to an individual that has some spiritual understanding and background that would go immediately to the woo-woo versus the corporate that might be more resistant to it, right? And one of the things that really sparked for me as you were speaking is that there's so much that we cannot explain about things that happen in our world.
Yeah.
And when I think about intuition and instinct, I think about it as our brains are so much more powerful than we can even possibly touch at this point. We don't have any clue how incredibly powerful they are. And so when I trust my intuition, my instincts, which has only happened in the last 10 years, I think 40s are the years that you start to go, oh, I knew that, and start to shed those insecurities, and we start to shed friendships that aren't serving us in positive ways, and relationships that don't serve us in positive ways and help us be the bigger, better, most positive, compassionate person that we can be, the most learning and curious person that we can be. We start shedding the people that don't support that. But I really believe that our brain, when we trust our instincts, it's really our subconscious that picked up on clues and cues that our conscious brain couldn't possibly have understood.
Yeah.
And so when we just know something, it's not magic.
Yeah.
It's not, some lightning that struck. We're not magical in that way. It's not a wizard kind of magic, but it is magical in that our subconscious brain picked it up, and our conscious brain is starting to apply what we learned or what we felt or what we sensed.
Yeah.
And just as an example, I was doing StrengthsFinder work with one of our state agencies. I had 54 employees that I was working with, and one of them had adaptability in her top 5 strengths. And every person I've known with adaptability in their top 5 or 6 strengths is a 2 to 3 year employee. Unless their job is really project oriented, where they really shift gears regularly, 2 to 3 years doing the same job is about the maximum that you can make that work if you have adaptability up there. This woman had been doing the same job for 4 years. And before that, the same job for 8 years. And it was the first time I started questioning the truth and accuracy of this assessment. Because I can tell you that I have yet to find one that wasn't accurate about the person once we started digging and asking their friends and family if this describes them. They're like, oh, that's not me. And their friends are like, oh, yes, it is. And they tell stories to describe it. So you can imagine that fear that I had put so much of my learning and investing into this tool to help me understand people and help them get out of their own way. And all of a sudden I'm doubting it. And she's like not fazed at all by the fact that I'm kind of freaking out about adaptability up there and how she's not using it in any way. And it doesn't make any sense. And I remember letting it sit for a minute, like just quiet. And we're just kind of looking at each other and smiling. She's very warm and friendly. So she wasn't judging me for being wrong, which is what I was sure I was wrong. And then all of a sudden I lean back. Now, I've never met this woman in my life. I don't know her other than this 1 hour session that we're sitting together. This is it. And I leaned back and I smiled at her. I said, do you rearrange the furniture in your house a lot? And her jaw dropped to the table. I am not kidding. She was shocked. She said, oh my gosh, yes. It drives my kids and grandkids crazy. Every time they walk into the house, the couch is moved over here, the TV is over there, the table's shifted, the chairs are moved. And I just looked at her and I got the biggest smile on my face. I was so filled with relief that that's how she fed her adaptability, because she loved her job, but she fed the adaptability at home in a completely different way. But the fact that I knew this about her was startling to both of us. Yeah. And so I keep coming back to this as you're talking about just knowing things and allowing yourself to just know these things, trusting yourself and not feeling like an imposter, because you have to trust that you know these things.
It's so interesting too. I'm teaching a beginning intuition class right now. And so we're talking about the second chakra as well. So the second chakra is the energy center. between the, like right below the belly button, essentially. It's the sacral
where the uterus
chakra.
is on a woman.
Yeah. So for a woman, it would be where the womb is. And one of the things that they're talking about, because intuition, you hear about a gut feeling, a gut knowing. So intuition in a lot of ways is in our gut, which also this chakra houses, it's our pleasure and pain center, essentially. And so we've been brought up in a society where we're taught to cut off our emotions. So it's our emotional center. So our emotions in some ways are our guide to understanding everything too. So as we start to awaken and as we start to feel more in our lives, what's both painful and pleasurable, pleasurable.
That too.
Yeah. We start to come back into that inner knowing too. Because I think you're right. It's like we don't understand the landscape of the brain. We don't understand the landscape of the heart fully, nor do we the gut. And we're starting to bring everything back online because we do have such deep intuition around things. You know, you think about the womb and women's intuition. And it is, I think when we're starting to live from that place, we start to have all of those synchronicities of, oh, I just knew that. I mean, had I not trained in this, I didn't know how much I was actually picking up.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. You know? So when somebody says, oh, deja vu.
Yeah.
I'm like, yeah, you didn't actually dream this, but something subconscious alerted you to it. So it feels like it already happened.
Yeah. It's interesting.
That's cool.
We talk about in improv, there's a notion or a term we call group mind, which is an experience of when we're all collectively setting the same intention to create together, that we're having the experience of actually coming up with the same thing at the same time over and over too, as our energy fields connect. I think all of this stuff is so fascinating because there's so much that we don't fully understand. And I think quantum physics and stuff like that is starting to pick this up, but we're behind scientifically right now too. So what feels very mystical, I don't think will stay just that way. I think we're going to understand it in the coming years.
Mm-hmm. Totally agree. And it's funny because I don't describe myself. I describe myself as not a particularly sensitive person in terms of my own emotion. I don't cry very much. I'm not particularly sentimental. So when I start talking about these things, people are always surprised because they're like, you're not a touchy-feely person, but you sure talk a lot about touchy-feely topics. Storytelling is my thing, right? Communication. But again, I keep coming back to this idea that there are so many things about our experiences that are simply not explainable. You can't use science to explain that when my mom is an identical twin, that she and her sister often have the same dream and they see each other in it and they wake up and talk about it as if this is normal.
Yeah.
So how do you explain that using science? You don't.
You don't.
Yet.
Yeah.
But I could see this making its way. I hope it does, because I think it will help resolve some bias and groupthink tendencies that are so damaging to our communities and to individuals. So I hope that we can lean in that direction.
Yeah. I mean, I will say if people ever want to take an intuition class, it is really fascinating what you will pick up on. And I'm telling you, because I think there's a skepticism part to people's brains too
which is good.
Yeah.
It keeps us from falling into the Music Man musical.
Yeah.
And Brigadoon.
Right. But I think that there's always, people are always trying to figure out, well, how did you get this information? How could you have it? Because my brain doesn't logically understand it. Mm-hmm. And the funniest thing to me because my skeptic is there too, and also the part of me that can fall very deeply into this work and is a true believer because of my own experience. And I always tell people, don't do anything unless you've had the experience. You don't need to get over your hump of skepticism, but if you remain open, you may find yourself in a situation where something really does completely change your perspective or blow your mind. But I'll tell you, even as an Akashic Records reader, there's information that I've pulled through where it's blown my own mind as I'm giving the level of specificity that wants to come through around this. There's just no way. It's not vague in any sort of sense. It's so specific to that person in a way that I would never fully understand. That it's
eerie
process. It's eerie. Yeah.
It freaks people out. This poor woman. How did you know I changed my furniture around? And I kind of felt a little bad for her because she was so startled by that. So I can imagine that you get that a lot more than I do. I at least have this this assessment where I can say, oh, it's just because, this is how you think and that's how I know this about you. But you don't have that tool in the same way that's like a solid statistical math-based tool that allows me to give that information and make it a little past that skepticism. So I really appreciate what you do even more. So just to wrap this up, I would love to hear, I would love for our listeners to know how to reach you, to connect with you if they want to. What are the best ways for them to learn more about you, about what you do, and to connect with you, Kat?
In the process of changing over our website, but my website right now is sheholdsthelight.com. So they can connect with me there.
Sheholdsthelight.com.
Sheholdsthelight.com is where you can learn more about what I do, and people book sessions from there too, if anyone is interested. And I also have an Instagram, but I'd say the website is the easiest way to get a hold of me or to understand a little bit more, because I say I do the Akashic Records and Cranial Sacral. It's like speaking a different language to other people. They're like, I don't understand what that is. They can read a little bit more about it there.
Great. And for our listeners, there will be a blog post associated with this podcast on elkinsconsulting.com. And I will have a link to She Holds the Light in there. I will also have some links to some of the things that we talked about so that you can learn more, dig a little deeper if you're interested, especially if you're a skeptic, because I think it's great to learn more when you are questioning whether something could exist. So I jotted down a few of the things that we mentioned: somatic healing, theta healing, cranial sacral, and Akashic Records. So I will be chatting with Kat after the podcast and making sure that I have the best resources for those things in the blog post associated with the podcast for your deeper reading pleasure. Kat, thank you so much.
You're welcome. And I will welcome anyone. I love a skeptic. So if you want to talk about it with me too, because I honor the skepticism in people and I love unpacking this for people too.
Well, that is your sense of humor and your improv background, I'm sure, too. Yeah. I love that. Yes. Kat, thank you so much for spending this time with me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. This was such a delight.
Are you ready to start your story portfolio so you have the right story ready to share when the opportunity presents itself? When you're ready to get started, my book, Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Tell Them Will, is available in all the regular places, and the audiobook version is available on Google Play and on my website, elkinsconsulting.com. As a special bonus for listeners, the audiobook includes 2 songs recorded by my band, Spare Change, in my living room in Montana. Also on my website is a free podcast interview checklist. It's available to download to make sure you make the most out of your next podcast interview. If you enjoyed this podcast, please feel free to rate the podcast and leave a review, and let me know that you've done it so I can thank you properly.
Thank you.